Hello, everyone. Welcome to our guest interview episode on libertarian populism. We hope that you had enjoyed our previous episode analyzing that topic, but we thought that it would be helpful to build on that initial understanding by having a discussion with an actual libertarian conservative populist and asking his thoughts on the past, present, and future of libertarian politics on the right. We believe it's important to engage directly with those individuals who believe in the politics we analyze so that we and the audience may gain an even richer understanding of this topic.
Yes, and today we'll be having my friend Sam here on the podcast. And just a little introduction for my friend Sam. He's a libertarian conservative populist. He is a recent graduate of the University of Washington with a degree in political science. He's a former alumni of the Rainier Institute leadership team. The Rainier Institute is a student-run RSO focusing on foreign affairs at the University of Washington. He is also a former leadership team member of the UW chapter of the Young Professional International Network, which works with the World Affairs Council to offer programs and provides forums for discussion of critical world events. So now, Jackson and I, Mohammed Kazarunian, will interview our libertarian conservative populist guest.
Yes. Well, first off, I'd like to begin by saying it's good that we finally have someone with a poli-sci degree on this podcast, considering we previously been rocking an IR and econ major, so it's good that we finally have someone who actually knows what they're talking about. But just to jump right in, explain a little bit about your general worldview. So in libertarianism, liberty is a big part of that. It's just part of the word in general. Why do libertarians care so much about liberty, and why do you specifically care a lot about it?
Yeah, sure. Well, before I start, I just want to once again thank you guys for having me on the show, and yeah. All right. So yeah, in essence, in America at least, I think the reason why libertarians really put a lot of emphasis on liberty here is, I think, partially it's because of the fact that the story of America's founding is in essence it is the story of liberty in a sense. I mean, our country was founded by people who believed in the principles of like classical liberal philosophers, like Locke, for example, and these ideas have I think essentially shaped they laid the foundations of our country, and in essence liberty almost is almost the very soul of America. So I think, because of that, liberty is, and you see it today, even today, in many different circles of American conservatives, where even if they have different ideas and ideologies, they always put in a very heavy emphasis on preserving the Constitution and preserving the the way of life that was created by our founders.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. You mentioned the conservative movement, and I think a big sort of through line between a lot of different conservative factions is the belief that America has sort of strayed from its founding principles. And depending on which conservative you ask, a lot of the reasons why they say this has happened is going to depend a lot on their own specific political philosophies. But in sort of your words, what do you think has sort of gone wrong with the country, and how has America strayed from its founding principles?
Yeah. Well, I think the big way you can see this is obviously since 1787 and 1776, the government's gotten a lot bigger, right? I mean, we have a lot more government spending, a lot more social programs. The presence of government is a lot more present in our lives compared to where things used to be. And I think, well, and also, this is like a big, this is going to be like a big issue with, used to be a big issue with conservatives in general, but it continues to be a big issue with a lot of like the libertarian leaning factions on the right today.
Yeah, no, I also want to add on there. You explained earlier why you believe liberty and libertarianism and constitutionalism are important to understand America and their importance in America's founding. And I want to also ask you, what do you think is their importance on a day-to-day level? Like, why is protecting liberty and protecting constitutionalism, limited government, like very important? Why do you believe they're very important in our day-to-day lives, in the marketplace, with our relationship with the state, etc.?
Well, I think part of that is, naturally, libertarians naturally believe that having less government intervention in the lives is a good thing for society. the idea I think is that the more the government, government is full of inefficiency, waste, and all that, and so the less government there is in our lives, the more government leaves people alone. The people can determine how to live their own lives and make whatever decisions are best for them. And so it essentially comes down to the belief that individuals can plan out are able to make the decisions of their lives much better than some state authority.
Yeah, Jackson, do you want to add anything else on our questions about the libertarian worldview?
I think that's a very good general summation of it. I think one way I think we're generally going to take this conversation is there's both an exploration of the broader sort of ideas of libertarianism, and as we discussed in our previous episode, how libertarianism fits into the sort of broader conservative world and how it's sort of played a role in American politics in recent history. So, Muhammad, do you want to ask a few questions about the Tea Party?
Yeah, I think this is a good segue to ask about the Tea Party. And I just want to say again, thank you, Sam, for that eloquent answer. We got Hayek and Mises here in the flesh. Ron Paul, Daddy Ron Paul would be really proud.
Exactly.
True. But yeah, turn to the Tea Party. So why, Sam, do you think the Tea Party and the libertarian, conservative, populist positions became very popular in the early 2010s, in the aftermath of the Great Recession and the beginning of Obama's first term?
If I had to sum this up in just 2 words, really short answer, I would just say national debt. I think, a big reason why I think, the Tea Party and a lot of the conservative movement that came from that movement became prominent in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I think it was because a large part of it had to do, I think, with a large increase in both government spending and the national debt that occurred during this period. I think what most people, might forget is, in the early 2000s, the government was running, perfectly fine, budget surpluses, and President Clinton even projected that we'd be debt free by 2013.
Right? Imagine that today.
Oh wow! If only.
Yeah, but I think it was. I think especially during George W. Bush's presidency, as more and more Americans saw the spending go up, the deficits go up, and the debt go up. I think the increase in all of this, these trends, I think it really got a lot of people worried. I think, and that the concern on the long-term ramifications of these policies, I think, is a big reason why the Tea Party, was created in the first place. It was, the whole point of the Tea Party. The original goals of the Tea Party were really focused on like reducing government spending and reducing the debt. So heavy focus on like fiscal issues. And I think, I think in essence, it was just a natural response to the large increase in the national debt and government spending that people saw within the decade.
I want to add on to that. There's definitely a populist dimension to the Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party, right? As you said, there's this outrage at the fiscal stimulus and the rising government national debt and the deficit. But there's also this like deep anger, especially amongst fiscal conservatives and libertarian conservatives on the right, that the Republican establishment, the party of fiscal conservatism, the party of free market limited government, hasn't been doing anything to reduce this government debt problem since maybe going back to like the 80s. I mean, Reagan had promised this and maybe didn't deliver. And people say Perot was supposed to be the big champion of cutting debt, but he wasn't able to get in office. Do you think there's this feeling of like betrayal almost, or this feeling that the GOP establishment isn't responsive to the base?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, the other thing too is, a lot of the increase in national debt and deficit spending came under the Bush administration. Right. And, the administration might have some excuses for this. I mean, there's a lot of, military intervention, wars that occurred during this period, a lot of tax cuts that were implemented. But, the fact still stands that this massive increase in the national debt and deficit spending occurred under a GOP administration, under a Republican president and a Republican Congress.
I want to add actually to that quickly is because at the end of the Bush administration, there's this big bailout, right, of the banks, right? The TARP bailout. And then Obama continues the bailout and introduces large fiscal stimulus. And at the same time, there's this massive recession going on, right? Millions of people losing their jobs. Right. Do these economic factors, both the economic contraction, the like recession that's happening, and the fueling, the bailout, the unfairness with the bailout? Are these factors as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing too is a lot of these bailouts weren't that popular with the wider voter base, and I think the whole idea, this is where you see some of the populist rhetoric kind of come in. The whole feeling was that why should these why should the big businesses that caused all these problems get all of this bailout money from the government? So why should the government be bailing out companies, on top of that, companies that might not exactly be fiscally responsible? So, there's like this, I think, and the fact that, of course, the GOP leadership didn't really oppose it as strongly as most people in the base would have probably preferred, probably contributed to the, to the Tea Party movement by, increasing the sentiment.
All right. No, those are great answers. I guess we'll move on to talk about the Tea Party's electoral success, because after 2008, they gain a lot of strength, and the grassroots movement really spreads. And then the big test is the 2010 midterms, right? Where a bunch of Tea Party candidates are up for election for the first time. They're trying to primary establishment Republican candidates who they deem insufficiently conservative. And of course, we know the Tea Party does really well in the midterms. The Republicans do really well in the midterms. Why do you think that is? And do you think it has does it have to do with the popularity of their message? Or is it simply the economic times were rough and people wanted to vote for the opposition party?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, of course, the fact that it was a midterm for a Democratic president did contribute to that. But yeah, I would definitely agree that there was, I think, a lot of genuine, I think the feeling was there that the spending and the debt had to be put under control somehow, and I think that sort of feeling did heavily contribute to why the Tea Party wave was as strong as it was in 2010.
Okay, so the genuine popularity of their positions, that makes sense. And then maybe quickly on the later Tea Party. So in 2012, the Tea Party wasn't really able to show like the same level of electoral success in the presidential election, right? Mitt Romney is the candidate for the Republican Party. He's an establishment Republican. No Tea Party candidate wins the nomination. And then in 2014, the Tea Party is effectively, it seems, absent from the election, and establishment Republicans seem to be in control of things. And it's interesting too, because in 2012, the establishment Republican does poorly. Romney loses, right? So maybe that's points to Tea Party. Maybe if a Tea Party candidate was there, maybe they would do better. But the flip side happens in 2014, right? Establishment Republicans are running that election, and they do really well in the midterms in 2014. What do you make of these election results? And do you think this shows the strengths or weaknesses of Tea Party?
Yeah, I think in 2012, at least, it seems in 2012, for the most part, the Tea Party just mostly focused on getting just Senate and congressional seats under their control. I think they did kind of try to, they tried to, I think, influence the GOP candidates into adapting their positions. I think, the big example was, there was reportedly, Romney met with a bunch of Tea Party activists, and he promised them that he would be 100% conservative if he got elected into office. But yeah, the Tea Party didn't really focus on like actually nominating a candidate, from their direct faction for the presidential race. I mean, of course, there was, Ron Paul's campaign in 2012, but that wasn't really seen as like Ron Paul wasn't really running to win in that election. So, and on top of that, again, like I said, the Tea Party, I think more so focused on just trying to indirectly influence the current GOP candidates towards, coming towards their position, adopting their positions. And in 2014, I think what happened was, the GOP establishment decided to, more actively intervene in a lot of these primary races to try and make sure the Tea Party wouldn't win them. Because the fear among the GOP establishment was that the Tea Party candidates were too far to the right, and, they'd lose a lot of winnable races. And so the GOP leadership did not want that to happen. So, and they were pretty successful too in the primaries. I think in a lot of the Senate races, I think every single competitive Senate race, they managed to get their leadership managed to get the candidate they wanted, into the general election. And a lot of these, most of these candidates actually won. So leadership did very well in 2014.
So you think that shows maybe a counterpoint to the Tea Party sort of crowd? Does that show that establishment Republicans were right? They believe that Tea Party was too extreme, that maybe the Tea Party had some good points in 2010 when it was appropriate situation with it in the dire straits of the economic crisis, but by 2014 the rhetoric was too much. Do you think that?
Well, I would personally say I don't really think that. Well, in 2014, it was just more. I think the leadership just did a very good job of running a good campaign and
Okay.
making sure the candidates were well funded. Because I don't think and in 2010, I don't think Tea Party candidates made too much of a difference in a lot of the key crucial races. I think maybe in one or two like important Senate races, it might have made a difference. But I think the impact of the Tea Party nominating their candidates wasn't quite as it wasn't quite as extreme as the leadership was claiming it to be. I think.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. You sort of mentioned the effects that the Republican establishment had when they decided to more actively intervene in primary races in 2014. But we definitely start to see especially around the 2016 election, it really seems, or it really feels at least, like the Tea Party has kind of started to spin out or lose momentum. I mean, there are sort of some vaguely Tea Party aligned candidates in 2016 who try to capture that energy. But of course, it's Donald Trump who ends up really capturing the energy of the Republican primary base. And after that, we do sort of start to see a decline in the sort of popularity of Tea Party era politics in the GOP in favor of Trumpism. So what is your opinion of why the Tea Party kind of begins to spin out or lose prominence going into the mid 2010s, and why it eventually really starts to be supplanted by Trumpism?
Well, first of all, I would push back a little bit on the Tea Party fizzling out during the period. I mean, after the even after the 2014 midterms, the Tea Party did play a crucial role in forcing, Speaker John Boehner to resign in 2015 and, replacing him with Paul Ryan. And in 2016, too, I'd say 2016 was the first presidential cycle where the Tea Party made an actual serious concerted effort towards winning the nomination. I mean, Ted Cruz was like the big Tea Party candidate in 2016 that was backed by that faction. And you also had Rand Paul, too, who also, unlike, compared to his father, Rand Paul made an actual, like, much more seriously concerted effort towards actually winning the nomination. And both of those guys were backed by the Tea Party. And the other thing too was, technically, Ted Cruz was the last guy standing in the primary. He was the guy that technically was the most serious challenge to Trump during the 2016 primaries. So the Tea Party wasn't quite dead in 2016, and it did actually give quite a bit of a hurdle to Trump's initial campaign as well.
That's true, but I definitely think you could say that it has certainly lost a degree of the edge that it had earlier, especially because towards the end of the Republican primary, Cruz was sort of seen as the last remaining anti-Trump candidate, or the last remaining.
Right.
Yeah, so there was it wasn't just a Tea Party. You had some establishment anti-Trump energy converging on Cruz towards the end, and even that wasn't enough to stop the Trump momentum, which I think definitely speaks to a weakening of the Tea Party. But even I think point taken, we can say that the Tea Party definitely has a degree of prominence even going into the mid 2010s, but it definitely does begin to sort of peter out during the Trump administration as Trump sort of takes more of a central role in the Republican Party. Why do you think that is, though? Like, why do you think you see a decline in sort of the prominence of the Tea Party maybe going into Trump 1?
Well, I think the simple answer to that would just be that, Trump was basically able to outshine the Tea Party. Essentially, the saying was, Trump basically stole the GOP, the Republican Party's base from right under their feet. I'd say similarly, he basically stole the Tea Party support base from right under their feet. Basically, I think, the base of the Tea Party, just like the base of the GOP, they liked, they saw Trump's message and they liked it better than what the current, Tea Party leadership was offering.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, of course, a lot of people attribute Trump's main appeal to populism, which I think is a fairly not controversial take to say that.
Right.
Do you definitely think that it was sort of there had been this populist energy in America almost maybe since, you could even say, 2008, Obama's Hope and Change campaign's a vague sort of populism.
Yeah.
Do you think that sort of Trump is building off of a wave of populism that had previously carried the Tea Party into power? Do you think he rides a lot of the same sort of social forces?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think a lot of the same, Trump and the Tea Party, there is some degree of overlap, especially on like, social issues and cultural war issues, that I think Trump was able to take advantage of. And, he simply was more effective at, conveying, at appealing to, those trends better than the Tea Party in a sense.
Okay. Yeah, then I think we'll turn to a similar sort of question here. I mean, a broader question that's being begged of the end of the Tea Party and being outshined by MAGAs. So what we're essentially, when we reach 2016, Trump won, we're at a point in American conservative politics that for the first time, perhaps basically ever, conservatism in America does not mean necessarily limited government, small government, reducing deficits, free market, like those things being the core or essence of American conservatism, because it was that way ever since, the founding of America. But with Trump, right, we have perhaps the first conservative in American history who doesn't make those things the primary focus of his campaign and his ideology. It's far more national conservative or nativist or American nationalist. Sure, it has some of the libertarian sort of ideas mixed in there, but it's no longer the essence of it, right? And this is really a historic moment, right? This hasn't happened ever in American history. And we want to understand from your perspective as a libertarian conservative, what do you make of that? What is that? What do you think that says about American conservatism?
Well, I would also push back a little bit on the fiscal conservatism, because in his first campaign in 2016, Trump did heavily emphasize the national debt and getting it under control. That was one of the main emphases that he put on in his campaign. But I think but it is true that the trend of fiscal conservatism has declined in the GOP within the past decade, and I think a big part of that was, well, I think the way I see it is, the Tea Party itself isn't like one, it's not one like homogenous block. Within the Tea Party, there are like different sub-factions, I'd argue, within that group. I think one of the factions within the Tea Party would be your typical, Ted Cruz's, Ron DeSantis's, have like the very heavily socially conservative, fiscal conservative types. Another group of faction that got created from the Tea Party wave, I would put as like libertarian conservatives, like, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Ron Paul, these types. That was also another subgroup created by the Tea Party. And then you also have a third group, which are basically just your average standard, regular Republicans that just took advantage of Tea Party energy. Just they use Tea Party rhetoric, but maybe once they got into office, they basically just did the same, the usual
business. The rhinos.
Yeah, they're called rhinos by everyone. But once they got into office, they just do the usual typical GOP establishment stuff, so to speak. Rubio is a big example of this. Pat Toomey to a lesser extent. But I think what happened here was, I think what happened here was when the base saw a lot of these, politicians just, using Tea Party rhetoric, but then going back on their word and, compromising. I think, a lot of them just got tired of, basically at some point the base just had enough of this, and, they basically decided to drop the fiscal conservatism aside. So if the leadership, won't take this seriously, then, screw this, we'll move on from this. And also another reason why I think they moved on for this was, I'd argue, even if it was initially, created by fiscal and economic issues, the Tea Party, I think over time started to put more emphasis on other issues, such as a lot of, social issues, immigration, and culture war issues. That started to be more and more, that started to become more of a thing later on within the Tea Party, especially I think, 2014 onward. And it was just that, and again, Trump was the first guy that came along that really took advantage of that energy that was being, of these new, of these new issues that were being created, and he took advantage of them. And the Tea Party leadership, was still mostly focused on the original, reducing the debt and the deficit and the national debt. And basically they weren't able to take advantage of these new branches of of issues that were being created by the Tea Party energy, until basically it was too late.
Okay, so just to get understanding of this, you're saying that there was already this sort of trend towards these social positions, political positions that Trump would later promulgate, like the immigration issue, hardline immigration issue. This was already apparent in the Tea Party, and as you said, as the Tea Party, the establishment, Republican establishment, as you say, betrayed the Tea Party base, they lost interest in promoting these values and instead were attracted by the other sort of important issues like immigration. And Trump came in at the opportune moment to, use that to his advantage and gain a lot of support around that. Is that, am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. It just came down to, on the fiscal issues, Tea Party felt the GOP leadership was just giving lip service. And on these other social issues, especially on immigration, I think is a big one. They felt the leadership was just flat out ignoring them and basically, telling them to go pound sand. So, that caused a lot of tension between the Tea Party activists and the GOP leadership because of that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think going on sort of the same general topic about the relationship between libertarianism and the broader sort of, I guess, more MAGA branch of conservatism that's ascendant in the GOP presently. You see a lot of argument, sort of, especially within conservative circles, about sort of the need to circle the wagons around MAGA or circle the wagons around Trump, regardless of any disagreements one might have with him. One thing you see people sort of saying is, perhaps MAGA is more statist than libertarians would like, or
Right.
perhaps maybe Trump has some personal idiosyncrasies that you're not okay with, or you think he's vulgar. But, liberalism, or modern liberalism represented by the Democrats, is a much greater threat to liberty than any one of Trump's personal tendencies represent. And Trump also did make a concerted effort in 2024 to win libertarians. He did speak to a group of libertarians and attempted to court them towards his campaign. What do you think of that general argument that if you have to basically pick a lesser of two evils, it's better to pick MAGA than it is to pick sort of liberalism, or to pick the Libertarian Party, or to not vote? Or do you think that that's sort of like a false choice?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not speaking for all factions of the Tea Party and Libertarian conservatives when I'm saying this, but I think the way I see it is, the big issue I think the Tea Party faced was, even if they did get a lot of influence within the GOP in the 2010s, they never got powerful enough to actually take over the GOP, like the same way that MAGA did. So I think a lot of the, and again, this isn't all Tea Party and like libertarian factions, but I think a lot of these factions, when they saw that Trump overtook the GOP in 2016, they made the decision that, they have to at least try to work with him and try to align with him as best they can, because, unlike them, Trump MAGA was strong enough to actually, take over the GOP. Right. So, because the Tea Party itself never got powerful enough to take over the GOP. I think it really just comes down to, that simple reality. And I think, so basically the Tea Party, or at least some of the factions within the Tea Party, decided to compromise. Now, of course, you have factions like the more Mises libertarian leading factions, like, Massey and Rand Paul's faction, for example, that chose to stick to their principles, so to speak. And, those factions still continue to exist within the party today, but, they're not quite as influential as they used to be within the party. And,
yeah, definitely. I think a big sort of question, especially once, Trump's a sort of elderly man, once he passes away in the future, I think one big question will be, is the libertarian movement within the libertarian faction of the conservative movement, is it going to have suffered for its relationship to Trumpism? You definitely see some more sort of, I guess, hardline perhaps is not the best word to use, but some of the more consistently libertarian people like Massey, for example, definitely think that it is worth drawing some lines with the administration regarding what you will and won't support. Whereas, as you mentioned earlier, there are some other people who were part of the original Tea Party group who think that compromising with the administration and maybe dealing with some unfortunate or disagreeable aspects of it is sort of valuable in terms of the concessions that you can get in terms of policy. I'm wondering if you think that one of those two positions is going to come out to have been the better one in the long run.
I think the way I see it is, well, I think at this point, the Tea Party and the libertarian wings of the GOP essentially have split off into two different, completely different factions at this point. I think that much is clear. I think with the libertarian faction, at least, the Masseys, the Rand Pauls, I don't actually think, I think they'll come out of the Trump administration relatively unscathed, because again, they were one of the factions that, most people like to focus on people like, like Kissinger or like Liz Cheney as like examples of resistance to Trump. But this hardline libertarian faction was a lot more independent minded, from the Trump administration than what most people, I think, would realize. Mm-hmm. And I think because, Trump certainly, he doesn't have the best of relationships with, people like Massey and Rand Paul. But yeah, I think the libertarian faction, I think, will also come out, will at the end of the day, come out of this relatively unscathed. I think even for the Tea Party faction too, they won't take as much damage from the Trump administration as some of the other factions in the GOP. Because I think the other thing, well, you got to remember too, is with the Tea Party, Trump didn't exactly have the best relationship with them either. When he, the Tea Party initially in his first term, tried to push some of the deficit reduction and reducing spending, and basically Trump told them to forget about it, and that was the end of that. And again, his relationship with people like Ron DeSantis also, is on rocky grounds right now. So, the Tea Party is also, at least the, people who are actually the actual Tea Party faction within the Tea Party, they did keep some level of distance from the Trump administration. They did keep some level of independence from it. So I think because of that, they won't be as impacted by, whatever fallout ends up coming out of the Trump administration than what most people would think.
Yeah, because there are definitely some people within the Republican Party who, they've tied their political prominence very much to Trump as a person. And you definitely are right to point out the Libertarian wing has a pre-existing sort of philosophy or ideology that they can fall back on even once Donald Trump leaves the scene. So they ultimately are going to have to do a lot less soul searching than perhaps other parts of the Republican Party are going to have to do.
Right. And I think on top of that, ironically enough, if anything, it's probably going to be like the establishment faction, the quote unquote establishment regular faction that takes the most damage, because I think, what happened in the, you're seeing this, happen in MAGA too, where, just like the Tea Party, you'd have these regular Republicans use Tea Party rhetoric and then just, pass the same policies. Well, now they've moved on to, talking in MAGA rhetoric to win Trump's endorsement and win their election, then, just being your average standard Republican once they enter office. Right. So I think, if anything, it's the leadership that's going to end up, leadership will end up, negatively impacted the most by whatever, if the Trump administration ends up going sideways.
Okay. No, I think that makes sense. I want to ask you a sort of follow-up kind of adjacent question to what we've been talking about. And so a lot of MAGA people will approach the sort of libertarian constitutionalism of the old Republican Party and say there's a certain naivete to that. They would argue that, we were talking earlier about how, MAGA believes that there are statist policies that are necessary to preserve liberty, but MAGA will also say there are statist policies that are necessary to preserve other important values to just save America, right? They say the MAGA argument effectively is, America's down the tubes, right? It's getting destroyed, and it's because we're not sticking to our values of nationalism, patriotism, strong borders, protecting industry, etc., right? All of these things, and destroying liberal cultural hegemony and all these things, right? What do you make of those arguments? Do you think that MAGA is right to criticize libertarians for not doing anything about that? I mean, they would say libertarians, they're in favor of free trade, which hollowed out our industry. They are in favor of letting the heights of culture like Hollywood and academia fall under the control of liberals, and they don't do anything about it. Do you think that they have an argument here, or would you push back on that?
Well, I guess a bit of both. I think, again, the reason why I think MAGA got created in the first place was, in addition to fiscal issues, the GOP base also started caring about, the original reason why the Tea Party got created, in essence, was, the core purpose of the Tea Party was to, restore America, so to speak, revive America. And I think, it simply comes down to the fact that, the base decided that in addition to fiscal issues, other issues needed to be addressed too in order to restore the country. And a lot of, social issues and culture war issues, they ended up deciding to take the route of using more state power, that MAGA advocates for, and decided that was a better method than trying to go for limited government. But naturally, obviously, well, that's what I'm going to say about this issue.
Well, just to follow up, do you think that's justified, their argument there? They would say, because of illegal immigration, we're in imminent peril. America's in crisis because of this. Because we didn't protect our industry, we're getting flooded by cheap Chinese goods, and we're losing our jobs. And they would say a lot of this is a response. This is their, because of libertarian sort of acquiescence. We'll just let the market decide, right? Same with cultural power, right? We'll just let the marketplace of ideas decide in academia, right? But MAGA says, well, if we don't stop liberal ideas in academia, if we don't stop, like the woke sort of stuff, don't win the culture war, then America will be destroyed, right? It'll become something horrible, right? Like, what do you make of that sort of argument?
I won't pass judgment on the MAGA faction. What I will offer are what the two, various factions of the Tea Party believe, or what I think the different factions of the Tea Party believe. I think for the regular, just the average, your standard Tea Party faction, you see this, I think, with Ron DeSantis, is they've essentially, I think, compromised on this issue, and they've essentially,
so they do agree with the MAGA.
They've gone with the MAGA position, at least on social issues. Like, they still advocate for the usual Tea Party, like the actual Tea Party original position on like fiscal issues and spending, but on culture war issues and social issues, they've adopted aspects of the MAGA movement. Whereas, people like Massey and like Rand Paul and the more constitutional libertarian faction, on the other hand, they've chosen to stick to their guns, and they vehemently oppose the use of any state power to fix any sort of issue, because they believe at heart that whatever good this policy might create, it won't be worth whatever negative ramifications come about because of these policies.
Oh no, thank you, Sam. That's a really good explication on like the libertarian perspective on MAGA's like cultural and economic agenda.
Yeah, going off of that, you've definitely touched on this a little bit in some of your earlier answers, but how generally do you see libertarianism as a ideological tendency developing in the future, now that it has sort of fallen on a bit on hard times within the Republican Party, or at least has had to make some difficult compromises, and given that there's no indication that the Democrats are going to adopt anything like it? You sort of touched on, there's two ways that the libertarians have responded to MAGA, sort of your either like DeSantis's and your Cruz's or your Masseys. Do you see sort of libertarianism developing in a way where they, take some stuff from MAGA moving forward into the future, like maybe a focus on more social conservatism? Or do you think the future of libertarianism is going to look more like Thomas Massey, with a sort of very principled, sticking to original libertarian ideas with as little input from Trumpism as can be gotten away with?
Well, I think the answer to this, in large part will depend on what direction the GOP decides to go in after Trump. It could go in a more, it could revert back to, what the more original Tea Party was resembled, or it might end up going in a more, like you said, like a more nativist, national populist direction. So, the direction of the GOP, I think, will play a huge part in whether or not, libertarian values and the Tea Party can make a comeback. I think at the very least, the Libertarian and Tea Party factions will always remain within the GOP, at least in the short-term future, because right now, as much as they would like to, because right now, in a pragmatic sense, the GOP, the right wing, is like the only place where they have like any degree of power at the moment.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I think also a lot of it will probably depend on how Trumpism looks at the end of his administration. If the administration is sort of broadly seen as being in disgrace, for one reason or another, I think I can definitely imagine a person like Massey getting a lot more sort of push within the party, especially because he can say, I stood against all the things that, were excesses on the part of MAGA, and that have sort of dragged our party down. At the same time, I can also sort of see if perhaps the election is closer than people think, and it becomes clear that MAGA still has some electoral power, perhaps people like DeSantis can pitch themselves as sort of a Trump with libertarian elements and without the really bad parts of Trumpism that were turning off swing voters.
Well, yeah. Well, I think, again, a large part of this will depend on the direction that the GOP, chooses to go in. I mean, it very well could go, down the direction of Ron DeSantis, where they decide, to try and they try this strategy of, Trumpism with all the good elements, take out all the bad elements, and triangulate the strategy. Or it might, Trumpism might become even stronger in the GOP, and they head off into the, in another direction.
Yeah. One last thing on this topic. There's been some interesting developments legislatively, just in terms of strange collaborations, such as the collaboration between Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which is not something a lot of people saw coming, given that those two are very different ideologically, not even mentioning that they're from different parties. Then this, of course, kind of goes off of Massey's general opposition to a lot of the more sort of statist elements of Trumpism. Do you expect to see, at least if Trumpism does remain increasingly focused on using state power for ideological ends, do you see more collaboration between some more libertarian-minded members of the GOP and Democrats on certain issues, at least as it remains to being anti-Trump?
Yeah, I definitely could see that. And I'd also add on top of that, you see, this kind of cooperation has been there, I think, ever since the Tea Party, became a thing back in the 2010s, right? This isn't really the case with people like, DeSantis or Cruz, but among like the Massey, Ron Pauls, and Rand Pauls, this is a very prominent thing where, there's a lot of overlap between their faction, at least, some degree of overlap, at least, between their faction and, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And even before Trump got into office, there were instances of bipartisan cooperation on certain issues within these two factions. And I think that's likely to stay even, long after Trump is gone.
Interesting. I'll be waiting for the 2028 Ro Khanna Thomas Massie ticket.
Left, right ticket.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our guest interview. I want to thank my co-host Jackson and our guest Sam. Thank you guys very much.
Yes, thank you
Thanks
so
for having
much.
me.
Yeah. All right. And that concludes our episode.
All right. We'll see you all next time.
All right. See you all next time for National Conservatism.
Ooh, interesting.